friends, we are so happy that our lovely guest speaker, Miss Marianne Gorski, agreed to join us as we have launched Some Answered Questions last week, and we are now on chapters 4, 5, and 6. Marianne, I've known 14 years, and she would be coming to San Jose as a guest speaker and would be giving these illuminating and amazing talks that really allowed us to not only be inspired by the lovely figures within our faith, but it also caused us to move. And that is the difference between a speaker, one that you just listen to and one that energizes you to react. And that's what Marianne does. Marianne served the Universal House of Justice as one of the first dozen or so staff members. After 16 years, she returned to the United States, settling in San Jose, California. While employed in Silicon Valley and after resigning, she traveled to share the knowledge of the Baha'i writings, staying months in various locations. If anyone ever asked Marianne, oh, could you come and give a talk? Never, ever did she say no. It was not in her vocabulary. The countries Marianne visited: Taiwan, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Iran, Nepal, Hong Kong, China, Peru, Poland, Belarus, Romania, Israel, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Cyprus, Greece. I know, I could just read the whole globe. Some universities she's spoken at are Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Manchester, Newcastle, and Dalian in China. Some presentations that she's given is at the First Women's Conference in Brest, Belarus, National Health Service Annual Meeting in Epsom, England. She now lives in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. She has created so many phenomenal CDs where at that time you could just put in your car and you were good to go. And you had the writings, you had her amazing research. And just recently in April of 2020, with everything that we were all going through with COVID, she wrote a paper called Crisis Times. Phenomenal, and even gave a presentation on it. So we are so excited to have you here, Marianne. Thank you so much for your time. It's all you.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you all for tuning in. We're so grateful for the technology that we can have these classes in the safety of our home and yet enjoying each other's company. My way of using Zoom, and I hope you will bear with me, is that I usually prepare a paper and I present the entire paper. Don't worry, it only takes 35 minutes. So you're not going to sit there for an hour or 2 hours. If you have a pencil and paper and you want to say something about what I'm presenting, please write it down, because we want to discuss what you have to say when my 35-minute discussion that I've prepared is available, is covered. So here's my presentation. This session is to look at 3 chapters of Some Answered Questions, where Abdu'l-Baha speaks consecutively of Abraham, Moses, and Christ. Those chapters 4, 5, and 6 cover 8 pages of divine prophets from God whose lives, history, and influence cover thousands of years. Of course, Abdu'l-Baha hadn't been asked by Laura Clifford Barney to relate the historic facts of those sacred lives and those thousands of years. The 3 chapters continue his theme from the previous chapter of proving humanity's need of those manifestations of God as divine educators and the spiritual powers bestowed upon him. And Abdu'l-Baha does this with such complete precision, and yet in a language that each of us can absorb. His talks in America in 1912 are really prime examples of how he spoke to the needs of the time, the capacity of the listener, rather than exposing too much knowledge to them at one time. You know, I should learn from him and do that. Now, we presenters assigned to speaking on particular chapters of Some Answered Questions take, shall we say, liberties of adding other facts of history and quotes from other literature of the Baha'i faith to enhance understanding of the subject in question. Very few of us, might we say, are not Baha'i scholars. Each of us, however, all of you that are listening to me, can consider ourselves Baha'i students. You may find me straying away from the main topic, even using non-scriptural references, but I love connections to broaden and go deeper into the surface of a theme. Forgive me. Having explained this, let's jump into this student selections in discussing Abdu'l-Baha's discussion on Abraham, Moses, and Christ. Let's start with some facts. Chapter 4, Abraham, pages 14 to 16. Abraham was born in Mesopotamia. It's thought around 1900 or 1800 BC. Mesopotamia is a recognized name, but we moderns often don't take cognizance of how formidable a land that was. It is now home to 4 countries. I got it written here: Iraq, Kuwait, Turkey, and Syria. Moses came from Goshen in Lower Egypt, and Christ grew up in Nazareth, Israel. Thus, these 3 divine prophets lived, one might say, in the same Middle East neighborhood. As stated, these chapters are not a study of their lives, but of what Abdu'l-Baha spoke of in Some Answered Questions. He wishes the listeners and readers to understand basic religious truths. The 3 divine educators experienced major similarities during the years of their ministries, such as these 5. Their station as a major prophet is chosen, and they are sent to mankind by God, the Creator, as his spokesman. At the time of their appearance, their known world is in dire circumstances. They all suffer hardships, from persecutions to exiles. They are all victorious over their adversaries, especially after their lives. History verifies the significance and expected efforts of their teachings on humanity and civilization. These 5 are a thread that runs through all of the lives of all of the manifestations. Ending chapter 3, having proved humanity's need of an educator and the divine power of revelation, excelling all human powers, chapter 4 begins with Abdu'l-Baha stating that Abraham was one who possessed such a power. Appearing, shall we say, at the beginning of the end of idol worshiping, Abraham brought the truth of a one God, the Creator, who should be loved and adored above all else. Historically, we know that idol worshiping did not instantly disappear with Abraham. The next chapter indeed will refer to this. We might liken the delay between the process of pronunciation and the execution of the statement to the United States Supreme Court ruling unanimously in 1954 that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. Yet it took decades before the ruling would be enforced by desegregating schools and not in so orderly or in a just fashion. Abdu'l-Baha explains the radicalness of teaching the concept of one God with a capital G and the rejection of many gods with a small g, which those many gods are being adored amongst those whom Abraham lived. Those people Abdu'l-Baha refers to as a powerful tribe that Abraham alone, unaided, had to face. Overcoming their beliefs was not a simple or an easy task. To help us understand this, Abdu'l-Baha uses the analogy of telling Christians in this day that they have to deny Christ. Such was the extreme of Abraham bringing this teaching of the rejection of false gods. Because of this, from the beginning of Abraham's mission, his sufferings were immediate and his exile imminent. All opposed him except his brother Lot and a few followers of no standing. Like the exiles of other divine prophets of God, those who ordered the exiles believed that such banishment would crush and destroy the new teachings. Abdu'l-Baha makes this personal to Abraham. For in those days, Abdu'l-Baha explains, to be deprived of social rights and suffer opposition, even if you were a king, one could not escape extermination. Yet the people and the perpetrators of Abraham's sufferings were blind to his power and God's assurance of the success of his mission. Abdu'l-Baha stated emphatically that Abraham established the unity of God. One can understand that this accomplishment was no small matter. Indeed, because it is so misunderstood in religious misinterpretation, Baha'u'llah's revelation very, very often emphasizes this principle of the unity of God, that there is only one single, alone, almighty creator. Science itself is becoming more odd as their discoveries of the universe postulate the existence of a powerful force that brought the unending variety of creation into existence. And here, my dear audience, is where I throw in other information that somehow relates to my theme. I might mention two particular scientists who have opposite sides on the subject of a divine creator of all and the purpose of creation. One is Sir Fred Hoyle, who has since passed away. Most of his life, he considered himself an atheist, but this is recorded in a scientific publication. Interestingly enough, it's from many, many years ago. Here's what the publication said. Fred Hoyle, who together with William Fowler, first noticed the remarkable arrangement of carbon and oxygen nuclear resonances, is reported to have said that nothing has shaken his atheism as much as this discovery. I very often use a quote from Fred Hoyle. I have always thought it curious that while most scientists claim to eschew religion, it actually dominates their thoughts more than it does the clergy. The other scientist who's still living is the author of a book that I'm presently reading, A Life on Our Planet, by the eminent naturalist and filmmaker of nature, David Attenborough. On page 65 of his latest book, he writes, I did not want to suggest that humanity was in any way separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. We do not have a special place. We are not the preordained and final pinnacle of evolution. We are just another species in the tree of life. You know, any mature Baha'i can easily go into an hour's discussion of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha's disclaiming this emphatic statement of Attenborough. Indeed, the kingdom of man is, as Baha'u'llah writes, separate from the animals and the primary purpose of all of creation. However, let's go back to chapter 4. Divine station of the prophet has been a big factor in negating the unity of God, as expounded and clarified by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. Previous religious followers had difficulty with the dual nature of their prophets, creating such beliefs as the Trinity. This presentation is not the time to go into great detail. You will learn more from other presenters of this forum. Suffice to read just one quote on the unity of God. This one is from Baha'u'llah's medium obligatory prayer, which means that it is recited 3 times a day. You're all familiar with these few words. I bear witness to thy unity and thy oneness, and thou art God, and that there is none other God but thee. Perhaps Moses himself used those very words, but they didn't get recorded in the Old Testament. What were the futuristic rewards and results of Abraham's life and teachings? Abdu'l-Baha briefly but effectively covers 2 in particular. He was brief. The first one, I'm not so brief. The first, God's blessing on the seed of Abraham, that from this would come all the past, present, and future educators from God, referred to this new day as manifestations of God. The 3 blessed women who carried the seeds were Sarah, mother of Isaac, Hagar, mother of Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael, Keturah, who bore 6 children. From that posterity came, Abdu'l-Baha states, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Christ, and Baha'u'llah. And of course, the Bab is also part of that. Here's where I enlarge it. This blessing that God bestowed upon the seed of Abraham is known as the ancient covenant, that he would never leave mankind shepherdless. This is a covenant that continued throughout the dispensations after Abraham and into the present day, so that we specifically understand. Abdu'l-Baha uses in a longer quote, which appears in Baha'i World Faith, he uses simple words but reiterates over and over again the link between all of the manifestations of God through the covenant. Here's Abdu'l-Baha's words. His Holiness Abraham, on him be peace, made a covenant concerning his Holiness Moses and gave the glad tidings of his coming. His Holiness Moses made a covenant concerning the promised one, his Holiness Christ, and announced the good news of his manifestation to the world. His Holiness Christ made a covenant concerning the Paraclete, which would be Muhammad, and gave the tidings of his coming. His Holiness, the Prophet Muhammad, made a covenant concerning His Holiness the Bab, and the Bab was the one promised by Muhammad, for Muhammad gave the glad tidings of his coming. The Bab made a covenant concerning the blessed beauty of Baha'u'llah, and gave the glad tidings of his coming, for the blessed beauty was the one promised by His Holiness the Bab. Baha'u'llah made a covenant concerning the promised one who would become manifest after 1,000 or thousands of years. He likewise, with his supreme pen, entered into a great covenant and testament with all the Baha'is, whereby they were all commanded to follow the center of the covenant after his departure, and turn not away even to a hair's breadth from obeying him. And we all know that would be Abdu'l-Baha, the center of the covenant. The second result of Abraham's was associated with his exile. His mission spread, and Abdu'l-Baha explains that because of the exiles of Abraham, all of Europe and most of Asia came under the protecting shadow of the God of Israel. Abdu'l-Baha concludes his address on Abraham with again two comments. He states the obvious truth that no one can doubt that Abraham was a perfect educator. How otherwise could a fugitive establish such a family legacy and faith except with that divine power from the one God who sent him to educate his creation of that fact? Would you like to hear that again? How otherwise could a fugitive establish a family legacy and faith except with that divine power from the one God who sent him to educate his creation of that fact, that he is the one God? The second, that if the above blessings were a result of Abraham's exile from Ur to Aleppo, what must be the benefits of Baha'u'llah's exiles from Tehran to Baghdad to Constantinople to Rumelia and to the Holy Land? We know that that exile also included the important high historic city of Adrianople. Briefly, exiles result in God's prophets and the growth of a number of new believers. These beneficial results were not anticipated by the perpetrators of their banishment. That concludes chapter 4. Chapter 5, Moses, pages 17 to 19. The truths and facts Abdu'l-Baha instills in these 2 pages plus continue the theme of God sending an educator with lessons befitting the needs of the time. That Moses was such an educator has long been accepted by much of the world, if not by all. To list Moses's handicaps and then his accomplishments would also prove the immense divine power bestowed upon him and the spirit showered upon the known world of that period. The handicaps of Moses that Abdu'l-Baha reported were 4. He stammered, certainly peculiar to a spokesman of God. He was known as a murderer, having slain a man to prevent his cruelty to another. For this, he was hated and despised. And finally, one might say that he was cowardly, having run away, hidden himself, and lived as a simple shepherd. In spite of this, and to prove the power of God himself, Moses was given the task of guiding a people, the Israelites, out of the depth of degradation and slavery and transform them into a great nation. The accomplishments of Moses vibrated around the world. His 10 commandments alone form the basis of many judicial principles and laws, though today some have fallen from grace. You might say that even though Moses was raised in the house of the Pharaoh, he was a simple man. However, who are we to truly comprehend the kingdom of the manifestations of God and their relationships to the Almighty? To appear as a humble shepherd and then arise a divine leader of a civilization certainly proves the power of the divine spirit. So what accomplishments of Moses does Abdu'l-Baha relate? 3, he freed the Israelites from captivity, transformed them into a new creation, and led them to the promised land. That first mentions 3 accomplishments. Second, he raised institutions that made the Israelites highly honored and respected. Many times I've related the institutions erected by Moses to those of Baha'u'llah because Moses, shall we say, institutionalized the 12 tribes of Israel. Baha'u'llah brought institutions that would be uniting the peoples of the world. 3, the wisdom of the Israelites was such that if other people displayed the same traits, they were assumed to be from that nation. Their continued development was such as to attract and influence the philosophers of the period and after. Abdu'l-Baha particularly mentions Socrates, which he has done on other occasions. He spoke of Socrates' visit to the Holy Land and taking back to Greece, whose people were still idol worshippers, the principles of the oneness of God and the eternal nature of the soul, which led to his being sentenced to death. The Universal House of Justice is specifically questioned about Socrates traveling to Palestine, as there are no historic records of that occurring. Its research department confirmed this, but like his father, Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha was the bringer of only truths. The House of Justice says Baha'is accept this hitherto unknown journey of Socrates as a matter of faith. Besides Socrates, other philosophers influenced by the civilization raised by Moses are also mentioned, and in specific fields. Galen and Hippocrates in medicine, Aristotle in logic and reasoning, Plato in ethics and theology. Now, how is it possible for a mere shepherd of sheep, a detested murderer, and one concealing himself from others, able to raise a great civilization that became the envy of the known world and that history continues to exalt? Abdu'l-Baha concludes that it was only possible by the supernatural power that guided him. I might interject here something of one of the prophecies fulfilled by Baha'u'llah in relation to Moses. That is, that Baha'u'llah's ministry would have to be equal to Moses's wandering in the desert, meaning 40 years. Perhaps for some of you, it might be explained, what is the difference between the ministry and the dispensation of a prophet or manifestation of God? The ministry is that period of time when the manifestation is on the earth as the manifestation of God. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817, but his ministry did not begin until he was imprisoned in the Sia Shah, the Black Pit of Tehran, in 1852, and his ministry ended with his passing in Akka 40 years later in 1892. The dispensation of a prophet manifestation is that period of time when the manifestation's laws and teachings are applicable. That is, until the next manifestation of God appears. In the case of Muhammad, his dispensation was 1,270 years until the coming of the Bab. With Baha'u'llah, his dispensation is revealed in the sacred writings as being at least 1,000 years, but it could be thousands of years. Chapter 6, Christ, pages 20 and 21. It to me is of interest to note that Abdu'l-Baha began his commentary on Christ by referencing Jesus having been born of the Spirit. As this mystery of Christianity has been a bone of contention among believers of various sects of Christianity and unbelievers alike. Such a beginning is almost like Abdu'l-Baha continuing to emphasize the importance and power of the Holy Spirit in the lives of the manifestations, no matter the duration of their ministry. For the ministry of Christ was only 3 years. The last, no, I'm skipping a paragraph. Let's not do that, Marianne. With Abraham and Moses, the Holy Spirit looks to have had its initial impact, let's say, at a certain mature age. With Christ, it appears at the very instant of conception. Who are we to speculate its connection with Christ's short life, 33 years, and very short ministry, again, 3 years? Claiming that he had come down from the heaven, Abdu'l-Baha says, the Pharisees rebuked the idea as they knew that he was the son of Joseph, a common citizen of Nazareth. The last chapter on Moses lauded the religion of the Jews and the resulting beneficial impact on humanity. Then why need God send yet another educator? Abdu'l-Baha concisely sums up the reasons. 3. Morals, nation, and people. The morals of the Israelites had become confused and corrupted. Israel, the nation, had been reduced to degradation, misery, and bondage. The people suffered from a series of invasions and captivities from Chaldeans, Persians, Assyrians, and Greeks, and by Christ's time, they were under the rule of Rome. We know the history of the Roman Emperor Herod, whose plan was to kill every male under the age of 2 in Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, believing that among them lived the expected King of the Jews, a threat to Herod's power and rule, who would be Christ. So early in his short life was he endangered. The Spirit, however, guided the Holy Family out of Israel and into Egypt. In this chapter on Christ, Abdu'l-Baha acknowledged, as he did with Abraham and Moses, the supernatural power of the Spirit making possible the achievement of the mission of Christ. This young manifestation did three things, according to Abdu'l-Baha in this chapter. He abrogated the Mosaic laws. He reformed the morals of the people, and he spread universal teachings of unity and love. Of course, such changes were misunderstood and feared by those who felt their power and authority threatened, especially and particularly the clergy. Let's take a moment to listen to just a few of the words of Christ on the three mentioned accomplishments. Mosaic laws. Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For amen, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or one tittle shall be lost from the law till all things have been accomplished. Christ fulfilled the most significant of the prophecies of Israel, the coming of the Messiah. The fulfillment of the other prophecies surrounding that major one were all fulfilled symbolically. Morals, Christ's words. You have heard that it was said to the ancients, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who so much as looks with lust at a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The teachings of purity expounded by His Holiness Christ were manifested in the purity of his own life. Unfortunately, again, misunderstanding of his not marrying was institutionalized in the early Christian churches, fostering celibacy on the clergy that continues to this day in the Catholic Church. Love and unity, Christ's words. You have heard that it was said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and shalt hate thy enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who persecute and calumniate you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, who makes his sun to rise on the good and the evil, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Growing up as a practicing Catholic many decades ago, reading the Bible was not encouraged. We would not understand it. Thus, it was the catechism that was studied. If I remember correctly, it was mostly made up of questions and answers. One of the first, if not the first, was, why was I created? And the answer was and is, I was born to know and to love God. This is a thread that runs through all Holy Scriptures. Alongside of that, God instructs us to love and care for each other. Permit me to relate a story that I heard while serving at the Baha'i World Center. There was a king who had 4 sons, whom he loved and trained. The time came when they were sent out from their father's kingdom to farm their own. Each went in a different direction. Years passed, and each son did establish his own kingdom. Each decided to return to his father and show him his success. Each arrived, coincidentally, on the same day, accompanied by an army of thousands. All came from a different direction as they had left, and saw on the other sides enemies heading with armies straight to their father's realm. Thinking they needed to protect the father, they started fighting with each other. The father realized what was happening. He stood on the top of his castle to order his sons to stop fighting. The moral of the story, as told to me, is that in recognizing the father, the sons recognized each other as brothers. You know that in the revelation of Baha'u'llah, there are the same teachings of loving God and all of his creation, especially our fellow human beings. Meant for the world, his principles go further, such as this very familiar and short injunction. Abdu'l-Baha speaks of Christ's own people wanting to do away with him. Their high priest wanted to crush his reconstructive teachings and put an end to their own anxiety of loss of pomp, adoration, and power. The world knows of the ultimate sacrifice made by Christ by all men, for all men and the world. He was crowned with thorns and crucified on a cross. Final paragraph. Though viewed at the time of Christ's martyrdom as his being one in misery and unaccomplished, Abdu'l-Baha says that Christ himself predicted his own ascent and the ascent of his teachings, and his enemies were brought low. We know those prophecies were fulfilled. The holders of power and authority in Christ's time are condemned by history. Centuries of kings and leaders to follow bowed down to his holy station, his eternal glory, and his message of love, piety, and unity. Christ was a true educator. Such, concludes Abdu'l-Baha, are attributed to the confirmation of God's divine power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We do have a question for you from John. So John, if you could please unmute yourself. This is going to be John Colstow, which I believe you do know him.
Yeah,
Yes.
hi, Marianne. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. It's been decades.
Yes, if not generations.
That's for sure.
Anyway, just a curiosity, you mentioned Keturah, but Keturah is not mentioned in the 4th chapter of Some Answered Questions. I wonder if you have any idea why.
You know, I said that Abdu'l-Baha answered very concisely. And he told Laura Barney that he was giving of his tired times. So he couldn't cover it all. You know, when I was asked by dear Neda to talk about these 3 chapters, and she said we could have up to 90 minutes, I thought, my heavens, everybody can read these 3 chapters themselves in 15 minutes. So presenters usually enhance discussion, enhance what the revelation says by bringing in related information for a better understanding. So that's the only reason I would think Abdu'l-Baha didn't mention Keturah. Any other questions?
I want to add with that, he was making the point of the word of God being disseminated through the seed of Abraham, and
Yes.
that point was made without being exhaustive.
Yes. Yes. You know, the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the loose expanding the revelation by Abdu'l-Baha, they enhance what the previous sacred scriptures had to say, such as, you know, Baha'u'llah verifying Muhammad's teaching that Ishmael was the one that was being sacrificed by Abraham and not Isaac. And so I'm sure there are things that are, I love, for example, The Secrets of Divine Civilization, because Abdu'l-Baha tells that beautiful story about the early Christian peasants out in the desert teaching Christianity to the king. This is a story Christians don't have. And yet Abdu'l-Baha shares it with not only us, but with the Christians.
We also have Dwayne. Dwayne, please unmute yourself.
I was wondering why in the chapter about Abraham, why he told the story of Abraham from the Quran's point of view and not the Bible's point of view.
That's very interesting because another book that is considered one of the most outstanding from the pen of Baha'u'llah is the Kitab-i-Iqan. And I always read the Kitab-i-Iqan as a young, uneducated Baha'i, as if it came from a Christian point of view, because I was familiar with all of the teachings that was being explained by Baha'u'llah. And yet, when I was a word perfect expert, I'm not a fan of Microsoft Word, but I can't use word perfect anymore. I was able to create a document horizontally rather than portrait. And I divided it into 2 columns. And I took the Kitab-i-Iqan and I wrote in one column the references Baha'u'llah used for the Christian teachings. And the other column was the references Baha'u'llah used from the Quran. Totally convinced that the column for Christianity would be 3 times the size as the column for Islam, for the Quran. And I was wrong, it was reversed, because the quotations in the Quran were duplicates of the quotations in the Bible. That might give you an understanding of your question. Any other questions, or did I do such a complete job?
You did such a complete job, but they want more. So yes, there's one more question from Robin here. And her question, Robin, do you want to go ahead and ask it, or do you want me to? Because since you have it in the chat, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering, we always hear about, you know, Abraham and Moses and Muhammad, and I was just wondering what Abdu'l-Baha had to say about manifestations from other parts of the world, or where I could go to. I mean, I have a lot of books. I've read little snippets here and there, but I was wondering if there was a particular place where I could go read that, because I'm sure the answer's probably longer than.
I'm kind of thinking the answer may be shorter, Robin, because the 2 particular manifestations that don't seem to be mentioned often is Krishna and Buddha. Now, I was told that in the case of Krishna, that some Hindus don't even know who is their prophet, who is their manifestation. And the Baha'i writings confirm that this is Krishna. You know, I have one of those little, where is it now? I had it right in front of me and now it's gone. One of those little cards that show the ladder of the manifestations, and it lists Krishna and Buddha. I don't see it on my desk.
I know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah. So the only thing that I have found where it gives them more information is Hushman Fatih-Azam's book, The New Garden. Hushman Fatih-Azam was one of the first members of the Universal House of Justice. And he's since, like all the other 8, has passed away. Because he wrote it while living in India. You know, he was a pioneer to India and he was on the National Assembly of India. And so he wrote the book specifically for his area of teaching, whereas most of the writings we have seem to be from an American and a European point of view with Christianity and Judaism and even Islam would spread to the West. I don't know if you can get a hold of the new garden. It probably comes out of the Publishing Trust in India and doesn't cost very much.
Okay, I will look for that. Thank you.
It's a very
I'd like
good
to add
teaching
another
book.
tidbit to that, and that
Sorry, let's see. We have one more. Jamie, please unmute yourself.
Yes, I was interested in the last story, Marianne, that you told about the king and
Yes.
his three sons, the message in that. And where is that story from?
It was told to me when I was serving the Universal House of Justice. You know, because I was such an early staff member, the whole World Center were like family. We did everything together. We fit in one room together when we had an occasion. And so we heard these precious stories just in socializing around. I'd like to tell you a story that I love. Do you mind if I stray?
No,
You mind if I stray, Nada?
no, I love those.
Please, please.
Oh, well, there are two particular House of Justice members that I considered my mentor. Ian Semple, who I mentioned to Nada before, and Ali Nachavani. Ali Nachavani was a pioneer in Africa and opened up many territories along with Enoch Alinga, the Black African lovely hand of the cause of God who was machine gunned to death. Ali tells this story about when he was living as a pioneer in Africa. He was speaking at a Baha'i meeting. And after the meeting, one of the guests said to Mr. Nachavani, well, what is the difference between the Baha'i faith and this other group running around, the moral majority? And Ali went to answer the question, and one of the African believers raised his hand and said, Mr. Ali, can I answer that question? And Ali, who's such a gentleman and so humble, of course, turned over the floor to this African American. Now, I tell the story exactly as Ali Nachavani told it, gestures and all. Moral majority is like a salad. You have this plate, and you have the tomato and the lettuce and the onion and the cucumber, and you have this meeting. And after the meeting, the cucumber goes away, the tomato goes away, the carrot goes away, and you've got the plate. Now, the Baha'i faith is like soup. You have this pot, and you put in the carrot and the potato and the onion and the cucumber and the lettuce, and you put it over a fire, and you have a meeting. And after the meeting, there is no carrot, there is no tomato, there is no radish. It's a new creation. The difference between moral majority and the Baha'i faith is the fire, and the fire is the love of God. Isn't that wonderful?
That is so beautiful. Bravo. Excellent. And love the expressions.
I love the story. Never tire of telling it.
if you don't mind, I'd like to go back a bit to the problem of Krishna. One of the problems is the fact that there is no such thing as a Hindu religion. The British, when they were taking censors, discovered anybody who is not a Christian or a Muslim or a Jain or something else was a Hindu. Actually, every village, like the days of Abraham, every village has its own god. Ram, for instance, is the co-equal of Krishna to many in many parts of India, and so you don't have a definitive monolithic situation there with Krishna. Krishna is, of course, a principle the principal deliverer of religious truth to many different Hindu groups. But the Hindu groups are what are just that. There's a collection of groups, and they have overlapping gods and goddesses, and Krishna is not a universal one among the Hindus. Ram
Yep.
is almost as significant.
Yep. Almost like continuing to be idol worshipers.
Almost.
Almost, yes. Any
And
other?
even there, interestingly enough, that there.
Oh. Sorry, John, I thought I didn't know you were going to continue. Go ahead, please.
Their gods were transportable. The village god, if the people of the village moved, the gods would move with them. For instance, there was some construction at the New Era school, and there was a whole village that moved in there as construction workers, and they kept their god and their way of worshiping with them as they appeared there to work on the New Era school. And so it's a very different kind of concept.
Yes. And pretty soon there'll just be one religion, one language, one humanity, and one heaven on earth.
Marianne, you said something that you said pretty soon. And I long since realized when I see in the writings soon, it means I won't live to see it.
Well, you and me both, John, because we're both of that vintage. But that's all right. You know, when Khomeini came back from France into Iran before the revolution, uppermost on his agenda was the extermination of the Baha'is. When he was in France, he used to send cassette tapes to his followers in Iran, preaching the extermination of the Baha'is. So he started the revolution, and the World Center turned into, as Ali Nachavani said, a community in mourning. Rahia Khanum, who of course was the guardian's widow, is overly sensitive with her love of the sufferings of her friends and the believers, and was quite upset of Khomeini and wanted to see him get his just desserts. And of course, like you and me, John, she was getting older, and people would tell her, well, Rahia Khanum, don't worry about it, because you can watch his what did I say? Desserts from the next world. And she said, no, I want to see it now. And of course, Baha'is are still suffering.
I'm sure you're familiar with the American prayer. Oh God, give me patience right now.
I always say, mercy for me, justice for you.
Touche.
I have really enjoyed this, Nada. This has been a wonderful experience for me. No. I'm so happy of this effort. You're reaching out to so many people.
Well, thank you. I know I'm going to be getting emails, and people are just going to be loving you. And I'm so glad that you let me share you, because you are a gem. I mean, the stories, I'm thankful, because I have all of your CDs. And I cherish the times that we've spent together, and this is not over. We're going to have you back again. So
well, once you finish the some answered questions, I hope that you invite me back to tell these stories. I have a talk just on Amata Baha Rahia Khanum.
Oh, I want that. Yeah.
I have these are not written down. I just take them out of my memory, and I have a talk about why those first 9 House of Justice members
Yeah, no, I definitely, I can't wait. Even for you to share the story of how Ian Semple changed your light bulb. So
Yes.
definitely, and those firesides with Ruhia Khanum. I
Oh,
hear those. Those
those
were amazing.
firesides.
Yes,
I,
Yeah.
think,
for sure, for
I
sure.
missed the,
Uh,
I missed the word you said about the 9 first members. What was it about the 9 first members in addition to stories?
I tell my understanding of what I witnessed in the development of the World Center, bringing in an institution that has never been in the world before. And they had nothing to start this institution, but it's the power of God that the mission was accomplished, which was our theme today. The power of God, the Holy Spirit sees that these missions are accomplished. But those first 9.
one more, Jamie. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I was interested in the last story, Marianne, that you told about the king and
Yes,
his 3 sons, the message in that. And where is that story from?
it was told to me when I was serving the Universal House of Justice. You know, because I was such an early staff member, the whole World Center were like family. We did everything together. We fit in one room together when we had an occasion. And so we heard these precious stories just in socializing around. I'd like to tell you a story that I love. Do you mind if I stray?
No,
You mind if I stray, Nada?
no, I love those.
Please, please.
Oh, well, there are 2 particular House of Justice members that I considered my mentor. Ian Semple, who I mentioned to Nada before, and Ali Nachavani. Ali Nachavani was a pioneer in Africa and opened up many territories along with Enoch Alinga, the Black African lovely hand of the cause of God who was machine gunned to death. Ali tells this story about when he was living as a pioneer in Africa. He was speaking at a Baha'i meeting. And after the meeting, one of the guests said to Mr. Nachavani, well, what is the difference between the Baha'i faith and this other group running around, the moral majority? And Ali went to answer the question, and one of the African believers raised his hand and said, Mr. Ali, can I answer that question? And Ali, who's such a gentleman and so humble, of course, turned over the floor to this African American. Now, I tell the story exactly as Ali Nachavani told it, gestures and all. Moral majority is like a salad. You have this plate, and you have the tomato and the lettuce and the onion and the cucumber, and you have this meeting. And after the meeting, the cucumber goes away, the tomato goes away, the carrot goes away, and you've got the plate. Now, the Baha'i faith is like soup. You have this pot, and you put in the carrot and the potato and the onion and the cucumber and the lettuce, and you put it over a fire, and you have a meeting. And after the meeting, there is no carrot, there is no tomato, there is no radish. It's a new creation. The difference between moral majority and the Baha'i faith is the fire, and the fire is the love of God. Isn't that wonderful?
That is so beautiful. Bravo. Excellent. And love the expressions.
I love the story. Never tire of telling it.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back a bit to the problem of Krishna. one of the problems is the fact that there is no such thing as a Hindu religion. The British, when they were taking censors, discovered anybody who is not a Christian or a Muslim or a Jain or something else was a Hindu. Actually, every village, like the days of Abraham, every village has its own god. Ram, for instance, is the co-equal of Krishna to many in many parts of India, and so you don't have a definitive uh, monolithic situation there with Krishna. Krishna is, of course, the principal the principal deliverer of religious truth to many different Hindu groups. But the Hindu groups are what are just that. There's a collection of groups, and they have overlapping gods and goddesses, and Krishna is not a universal one among the Hindus. Ram
Yep.
is almost as significant.
Yep. Almost like continuing to be idol worshipers.
Almost.
Almost, yes. Any
And
other?
even there, interestingly enough, that there.
Oh. Sorry, John, I thought I didn't know you were going to continue. Go ahead, please.
Their gods were transportable. The village god, if the people of the village moved, the gods would move with them. For instance, there was some construction at the New Era school, and there was a whole village that moved in there as construction workers, and they kept their god and their way of worshiping with them as they appeared there to work on the New Era school. And so it's a very different kind of concept.
Yes. And pretty soon there'll just be one religion, one language, one humanity, and one heaven on earth.
Marianne, you said something that you said pretty soon. And I long since realized when I see in the writings soon, it means I won't live to see it.
Well, you and me both, John, because we're both of that vintage.
Nightingale, wouldest thou with the divine rapture experience true spiritual attraction? Lay down my life in the path of the friend and sacrifice your soul in the wilderness of his love, in the wilderness of his love, in the wilderness of his love.
Thank you so much, Patty.